Hi, my name's Karen Sherwood. I'm owner, founder, director of Cupola Gallery, also known as Cupola Contemporary Art. And we also have
Graham Shapley. I'm the manager at the gallery. I help Karen curate the shows and put them up.
So we're both here because we thought it would be quite nice to have a little chat about the current exhibition we've got on at the gallery at the moment, which is a solo show by Sheffield born and bred artist Corinna Button, who has been showing with Cupola for almost as long as I've been open, so around 30 odd years. And the current exhibition is called Scratching the Surface, Breaking Through. It is currently showing and is on until the 16th of November. So Graham and I are just going to talk about the works in the show, things that particularly appeal to us, a bit of background information about the work, and just to give you some thoughts about how we respond to the work. But of course, every viewer brings themselves to what they look at, seeing as are we going to just do this with pictures or without? We're going to try and speak kind of a visual representation of the work.
Well, it's a podcast, so generally you don't look at something whilst you're...
I don't know if we're going to turn it into a video as well.
No, it's just going to be like a radio show.
Okay. So, Graham, when did you first come across Corinna's work?
Working here.
Yeah.
I think it's less poignant where I first came across it. But I think it would be really helpful if you told everyone about Corinna's first show here, because I think her change from that first show to now is really poignant.
It's really interesting, actually, because Corinna's first show was probably, well, I'm pretty sure it was back in the 90s. And Corinna trained as a printmaker. Well, actually, I suppose we ought to say where she did train. I'll have to remind myself, actually, but it was all printmaking, the very first exhibition we had. And Corinna's work has always been about aspects of her own personal life and family life, as well as kind of commentaries on community, society, the world at large, really. And it's been really interesting to see how her work has developed over these years. It's always had a very strong feature of women. She has two sisters, so she's one of three. She now has her own daughter, but the images have always featured women, usually herself or images of herself. But certainly early days, there was images of partners. It was to do with potential other career choices. There were things to do with dance and music, as well as kind of personal stories. And now the images we've got currently tend to be more focused on a face and fractured images. And nearly all of this work that we've got in this exhibition is painting as opposed to printmaking, although printmaking is still a very core part of her work.
Okay. So, and that first show was predominantly printmaking?
I think it was all printmaking, actually. But Corinna has always been a multifaceted printmaker. So in other words, they weren't just etchings, they weren't just aquatints, they weren't just monotypes. The Corinna has always been interested in the process. She mixes it up. So I think most of them were etchings, aquatint with monotype. I think she's always used carborundum. There may have been woodcuts in there. She's always liked a bit of texture. I think may have been collagraphs in there as well. I'm pulling things out the bag now. 30 years ago, it's quite a while. But people were always interested because her surfaces were always really interesting. It wasn't necessarily obvious that they were printmaking because they've always had a very free, a very kind of gestural aspect to the work.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's nice to hear. That's definitely something that's not changed. If anything, her paintings now incorporate more techniques than is that easy to identify.
That's right. Corinna says one of the reasons she titled the current exhibition as she did was because scratching the surface is something you have to do as a printmaker. She said, I've always been interested in surfaces and scraping back. So obviously as a printmaker, you have to scrape back ink, you have to use scrim, you have to rub off the plates, you have to, add surfaces, take them away. And she says, I like the idea of peeling back to reveal something, even when I'm doing my painting. And Corinna is well known for using her printmaking techniques in her paintings. So she'll use her printmaking rollers, she'll use aspects of print, so potentially creating a print surface that she'll incorporate into her paintings. And definitely that richness of layering and pulling back is the overriding sensation you get from the work, really, isn't it? That they are not simple surfaces. They're very layered. They're very nuanced. There's lots of things that appear like accidental marks, which you get in printmaking as well.
Yeah, and the layering is not. It's hard to tell which is the top layer because things seem to weave into one another. So what might be a predominant feature is actually what's underneath. So, for example, the one that's currently behind you, which is a large portrait, one of the things that really stands out is the material that she's used underneath the whole painting, which is torn up pieces of wallpaper. Yet that's a really predominant feature, even when you get to that top layer with everything built over the top of it. That layer underneath, the foundational layer, is still something that's sort of showing through. So
definitely, and this is the thing with Corinna. Makes a Corinna makes a very heavy textured surface, and not only is it a visual effect, it makes references, because certainly wallpaper and a female figure, you've got this idea of domesticity, wallflower, all kinds of other meanings that you can project into, or you can take that from it, as well as an interesting visual effect, really. And that's what I like, that you can look at it as an artist or someone who has no interest in process at all and just, sees the final image and finds it fascinating and engaging because of the way it looks different in different lights and how you can change your focus when you look at it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite interesting, especially the relationship between the title and her current sort of subject matter. And you were sort of talking about sort of women being a wallflower and things. You've got a lot of sort of social media and how we see ourselves coming into the subject matter of her work. So you've got screens appearing. There's one above there called If You Play, which could almost be a whole series of mobile phones stuck together to form the face.
I think the full title is If You Play Your Cards Right.
Okay.
So it is to do with there could be cards, there could be screens, it's referencing certainly the current body of work that we have now. There's a lot of almost flickering images. She's got faces, portraits that she's almost sliced up and then put back together. So it is that idea of things constantly changing. We are being bombarded all the time. We have access to visual imagery 24/7. And Corinna has said herself that sometimes you switch your phone on and all of a sudden it's blasting music or playing something and you didn't think you pressed anything. And there's that idea of a bit of chaos or a bit of kind of overwhelm in terms of what's going on. And then the fact that it's faces and, we are certainly, as I am as a woman, very aware that how we look, how we present ourselves is often judged and considered, and therefore that dominance of the female face, within these images is again something Corinna is very aware of. So she says that some of the pictures that almost look like, when somebody turns very quickly and you're taking a photo and you get a kind of a blurred image. Well, Corinna's making reference to kind of some of that in some of the portraits she's done. And she says there's a bit of humor in that, because that's that idea of moving, but also, is this my best side? Is this my best side? That idea of actually being aware of the view, being viewed, as well as all these images kind of coming towards us. And the idea of the social as well, because she's used in some of her paintings multiple people, multiple images too.
So I think Corinna's approach to looking at the female form is quite interesting, because you can see it in some of her, I don't want to say mid-period, but
years ago, yeah.
A few years ago. And some of the earliest pieces that I saw of Corinna's were of younger girls, and generally groups of them that you'd sort of see hanging around. I don't want to say the word chav, but it's that kind of culture, whereas her more recent work is a lot more glamorous. And I think that's reflected in perhaps the changing culture from the sort of late 90s, early 2000s, kind of what could be considered chav culture, to how a lot of girls are portrayed now, which is there's this attempt to be more glamorous, to be more sort of almost hyper feminine in some ways.
That's interesting, because I remember when Corinna was doing more of the groups of women hanging about, if you like, and the muffin tops that were in evidence in these images. She introduced me to a term I'd not heard before, which was smirting. Do you know
I've not heard of that either.
Smirting is apparently smoking and flirting. Because do you remember when they made it illegal to smoke inside, so you had to go outside? Yeah. And she said she noticed it. So she did a series of works about it, because, her children were probably dating, nightclubbing, and she was just noticing how, people were behaving. And so often, Corinna has done works that reflect what's going on around her in her everyday life. I mean, when her children were very young, she did images about that. She did images about brushing her child's hair, when she was that age. She did, before she'd had children, she did a series of work that was to do with, a woman of the 80s, trying to do everything, trying to be a mother and a working professional. Those kind of images appeared in her printmaking. So essentially her work has developed, but the themes of women and the female view and the female experience, it is clearly still manifest in the work that we're showing at the moment. So yeah.
I mean, it's always hard for me to comment on specifically the female view, kind of coming from a position of being man.
Being female. Yes, absolutely right. But I mean, men buy a lot of Corinna's work. I mean, it's really, the one thing I would say about Corinna's work, and it's always been the case, is I find it very emotionally rich. The works are quite gutsy, because there's clearly a lot of physical activity in order to make these works, whether they're printmaking, whether they're painting. These are hard-won images. They're not dashed off. There's a lot that goes into them, and I think that's evident in the finished pieces.
Yeah, I mean, you can see the labour in just from almost the sheer amount of paint on some of them.
That's right. And collage and all the rest of it. What's interesting for me is people are often asked, are the faces Corinna? And, I don't see them as Corinna, but clearly there's elements of Corinna in the faces. I mean, sometimes I can definitely recognize maybe her daughter's face, or there's a face in one of these that is probably the only male figure I've got, that's represented in the exhibition. And I said, well, it looks like Simon, which is her husband. And Corinna goes, well, it isn't Simon. And her daughter goes, yeah, but it looks like Simon, So you use what you know, I think, in the images.
I think it's quite hard for any artist to not put themselves in their work.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you do emotionally, but in terms if you're a figurative artist, I think you can't help but paint what you know.
I mean, there are other artists that also may not deliberately put themselves in their work.
Oh, yeah.
But
the images,
whenever it's a representation of a woman, you can't help but see them in those pieces of work.
Absolutely. And for me, sometimes more than others. But interestingly, the color palette that Corinna uses has been generally over the years relatively dark. But obviously with printmaking, there's been black and white, and there's been kind of quite rich, but it tends to be darker color. And in these ones, there are browns and blues and kind of some black kind of graphic elements. But there is also a couple which are pretty bright pink.
There's quite a lot that are very hyper sort of. They're almost fluorescent in some cases of the colours that's been used.
Absolutely. And I think that, again, links to that idea of the dynamism of the social media and the multimedia world, and that impact, that the way that has a visual impact on us. But anyway, we've been talking for a bit too long, so we're going to draw it to a close there. And just to say again, Corinna's exhibition is on at Cupola Gallery until the 16th of November. We're open Monday to Saturday, 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. But there's also images online, and we intend to put a video online as well.
Okay, thanks for listening.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye.